Welcome back to another episode of Intel Focus, the review series. Today we're going deep on something, a topic that's kind of woven into the very fabric of our digital lives these days, surveillance. It's everywhere. Have you ever stopped to think about how much our attitudes toward being watched have actually changed, especially with everything going digital these days?
It is really remarkable how quickly technology changes, not only what's possible, but what we consider normal, even acceptable. This stuff, or was once dystopian fiction, is now presented as a tool for progress and convenience.
Yeah. It's almost like the line between creepy and convenient keep getting blurrier and blurrier.
Yeah.
To help us untangle this whole topic, we're turning to a really insightful academic paper. It's called The Transformation of Surveillance in the Digitalization Discourse of the OECD, a brief genealogy.
Yes, this paper, published in the Internet Policy Review just this past August, it takes us on this fascinating journey through the evolving views on surveillance, seen through the lens of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, better known as the OECD.
The OECD. So that's the group focused on boosting economic growth and cooperation between democratic nations, right?
That's right.
What's their take on all this?
What's fascinating is, back in the 1950s, through the 70s, their approach to data was surprisingly cautious. You might even say they were ahead of their time in recognizing the potential for computerization to erode privacy and individual freedoms.
Really. So while everyone else was excited about the potential of computers, the OECD was sounding the alarm about Big Brother.
Well, not exactly Big Brother, but they were definitely wary. For example, in 1971, they recommended that personal data should be kept in decentralized systems, even if it meant less efficiency, to avoid the creation of those centralized personal dossiers that could be so easily misused.
So they were prioritizing individual rights and freedom over efficiency, even in the face of new technology. Makes sense, especially given the historical context.
Exactly. Remember, this was in the wake of World War II, when the horrors of data-driven persecution were still fresh in everyone's minds. George Orwell's 1984 had also become a cultural touchstone, warning against the dangers of totalitarian surveillance states.
So everyone was walking around reading 1984 and looking suspiciously at their toasters. I can see how that would create a climate of caution. But what specific concerns did the OECD raise about surveillance back then?
One major worry was the potential for all this data collection to stifle individual growth and potential. They were concerned that if you're constantly being monitored and judged based on your past data, it could create a chilling effect on free expression. Imagine feeling like you can't try new things, voice unpopular opinions, or even just change your mind for fear of how it might be interpreted by the data gathering machines.
It's almost like they saw data as a trap, fixing you in place, based on some snapshot of who you were in the past, rather than allowing you to evolve and grow.
That's a great way to put it. And this concern was reflected in some of their recommendations. For example, in 1974, they explicitly cautioned against using computerized student tracking systems, fearing that they could limit students' opportunities based on their past performance. Remember, this was long before the multi-billion-dollar educational software market we see today.
Wow, talk about a different world. They were really advocating for protecting the potential of the individual, even if it meant sacrificing some efficiency. But something changed, right? This cautious approach didn't last forever.
You're absolutely right. A major shift started to take hold around the 1990s, driven by economic pressures, the rise of the internet, and a clever rebranding of surveillance practices.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Tell me more about this rebranding. How do you make surveillance sound appealing?
Well, think about it. Tracking movements, something that was once a chilling hallmark of oppressive regimes, suddenly became a desirable feature of personalized travel services. Remember those early travel websites that boasted about remembering your preferences and tailoring your experience?
Yes. Convenience disguised as personalized service? We're watching you, but only to make your life easier.
Exactly. And that same shift happened in other areas. Computerized student tracking, which was once feared for its potential to limit opportunities, morphed into the multi-billion-dollar educational software market we see today. The narrative shifted from control to opportunity and efficiency.
So Big Brother morphed into a friendly tutor, promising to help you reach your full potential with the help of your data, of course. It's fascinating how language and framing can completely change the perception of something like surveillance.
Absolutely. And this shift was reflected in the OECD's own discourse. In 1997, they published a report advocating for a balanced approach to data protection, recognizing the economic benefits of information sharing, while also acknowledging the need to mitigate risks. This marked a significant departure from their earlier emphasis on minimizing data collection.
So a balanced approach. Sounds reasonable on the surface, but how do you actually strike that balance? Where do you draw the line between reaping the benefits of data
Yeah.
and protecting individual privacy?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that continues to be debated today. But before we delve into that, let's take a closer look at how this shift towards a balanced approach paved the way for the rise of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, where our personal data became the raw material for a vast and profitable industry.
Okay, surveillance capitalism. Now, that's a term I've heard thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it. Can you break it down for me and for our listeners who might be wondering the same thing?
Absolutely, in a nutshell. Surveillance capitalism. It refers to a business model where companies collect and analyze vast amounts of data about you. Your online behavior, your location, your purchases, even your moods and emotions, in order to predict and influence your actions. This data is then used to target you with personalized advertising products and services, all designed to keep you engaged and spending.
So it's not just about companies knowing what you buy. It's about them understanding why you buy it and then using that knowledge to nudge you towards buying even more. It's like they're trying to hack our brains.
That's a pretty apt analogy. And the thing is, this data collection is often happening without our explicit consent or even our awareness. Think about all the times you've clicked "I agree" on those lengthy terms and conditions without actually reading them. Or all the free apps and services you use that are actually collecting and monetizing your data in the background.
It's like we're trading our privacy for convenience without even realizing it. But how did we get here? Didn't the OECD, with its focus on balanced approaches to data protection, see this coming?
That's a complex question and one that researchers are still grappling with. But it's important to remember that the OECD's shift towards a balanced approach coincided with the rise of the internet and the explosion of e-commerce. There is a genuine belief that data-driven innovation could unlock tremendous economic potential. And there is a lot of pressure to avoid stifling this growth with overly restrictive regulation.
So it's a bit of a gold rush mentality. Let's not overthink this. Let's just get the data flowing and see what happens.
You could say that. And in fairness to the OECD, they did continue to emphasize the importance of transparency and consumer trust. They advocated for things like clear privacy policies, data security measures, and mechanisms for individuals to access and control their data.
But wasn't that a bit like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound? I
Yeah.
mean, how much genuine control do you really have when you're dealing with these tech giants who have armies of lawyers and algorithms on their side?
That's a valid point, and one that critics of surveillance capitalism have been making for years. They argue that this emphasis on individual control puts too much burden on the user and ignores the power imbalances inherent in these systems. They advocate for stronger regulations that limit data collection in the first place, rather than relying on individuals to navigate a complex and often opaque data landscape.
So it's not just about giving people the right to opt out. It's about setting limits on what data can be collected in the first place.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But hasn't there been some pushback against these surveillance practices, especially in recent years?
Absolutely. We've seen a growing awareness of the potential harms of unfettered data collection. And there have been some significant legal and regulatory developments. For example, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which came into effect in 2018, has been hailed as a landmark piece of legislation that gives individuals more control over their personal data.
The GDPR.
Yeah.
That's the one that makes all those annoying cookie pop-ups appear on websites, right?
Yeah.
But is it actually doing anything to rein in these tech giants?
It's definitely had an impact, though the full extent of its effectiveness is still being debated. One notable example is the EU's recent ruling against Meta, formerly Facebook, for illegal behavioral advertising. This ruling found that Meta's practice of tracking users' online behavior across multiple websites and apps, without their explicit consent, violated the GDPR.
That sounds like a pretty big win for privacy advocates. Does this mean the tide is turning against surveillance capitalism?
It's certainly a positive sign, but it's just one battle in a much larger war. The fight for data privacy is ongoing, and it's playing out on multiple fronts, in courtrooms, in legislatures, and in the court of public opinion.
So it's not just about legal battles. It's also about raising awareness and changing the narrative around data collection and surveillance. But what about those situations where surveillance is seen as necessary for the public good, like preventing terrorism or tracking the spread of a pandemic? How do we reconcile these needs with individual privacy rights?
That's the crux of the issue, and one that's become even more pressing in recent years. The COVID-19 pandemic, in particular, brought this tension to the forefront as governments around the world implemented unprecedented surveillance measures in the name of public health.
Right. We saw everything from contact tracing apps to real-time location tracking using cell phone data. It felt like we were stepping into a sci-fi movie, but not necessarily a feel-good one.
It definitely raised a lot of ethical and legal questions, and it highlighted the need for clear guidelines and safeguards to prevent these technologies from being misused or overreaching their intended purpose. And this brings us to another important dimension of the surveillance debate: the role of governments.
Okay, so we've talked about big tech and the rise of surveillance capitalism. Now we're bringing governments into the mix. How has their role in surveillance evolved alongside these technological advancements?
One of the most striking developments is the blurring of lines between government surveillance and corporate surveillance. We're seeing increasing collaboration between governments and tech companies, with governments often relying on the vast data troves of companies like Google and Facebook for everything from law enforcement to intelligence gathering.
So it's not just about governments watching us directly anymore. It's about them tapping into these massive private data streams that are already being collected. It's like a public-private surveillance partnership.
Yeah. Exactly. And this raises a whole host of concerns about accountability and oversight. Who's responsible for ensuring that this data is being used responsibly and ethically? And what recourse do individuals have if their rights are violated?
It feels like we're entering uncharted territory here, and the rules of the game are still being written. But speaking of uncharted territory, the paper we're discussing introduces this concept of infopower. Can you elaborate on what that means and why we should care?
Infopower, a term coined by philosopher and technology scholar Colin Koopman, describes the ways in which our data shapes and constrains our lives, often in subtle and insidious ways. It's the idea that the information we generate, our digital footprints, our online behavior, our social media posts, can be used to predict our actions, influence our choices, and even limit our opportunities.
So it's not just about being watched. It's about our data being used to subtly manipulate us, to steer us in certain directions without us even realizing it.
That's a big part of it. Think about those personalized recommendations you get on Amazon or Netflix. They're based on algorithms that analyze your past behavior and try to predict what you'll want to watch or buy next. On the surface, it seems convenient, but it also creates a filter bubble that can limit your exposure to new ideas and perspectives.
It's like living in an echo chamber, where you're constantly being fed information that reinforces your existing beliefs and preferences. But couldn't this type of data analysis also be used for good, like helping people make healthier choices
Oh,
or connecting them with resources they need?
absolutely. That's the double-edged sword of info power. It has the potential to be incredibly beneficial, but it also carries significant risks if it's not used responsibly and ethically. The key is to be aware of how these systems work, to understand their limitations, and to demand transparency and accountability from those who control them.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the early fears of Big Brother to the rise of surveillance capitalism and the growing influence of infopower. It's a complex and ever-evolving landscape. But for our listeners who are feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this, what are some practical steps they can take to protect their privacy and reclaim some control over their data?
That's a great question, and one that I get asked a lot. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of these massive data gathering systems. But there are things you can do. First and foremost, be aware of your digital footprint. Pay attention to the data you're sharing online, and be mindful of the apps and services you use.
Right. It's easy to fall into the trap of convenience, but those free services often come at a hidden cost: our data.
Exactly. And don't just blindly click "I agree" on those lengthy terms and conditions. Take the time to understand what you're consenting to, and consider whether the benefits outweigh the risks.
Easier said than done, right? Those things are written in legal jargon that's practically designed to be incomprehensible.
I hear you, but there are resources out there to help you decipher the fine print. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Privacy International offer great guides and tools. And beyond individual awareness, we need to advocate for stronger privacy regulations and hold tech companies accountable for their data practices.
So it's a combination of individual action and collective action. We need to be smarter about how we use technology, but we also need to push for systemic change.
Absolutely. And that's the note I'd like to end on. This deep dive has shown us how the landscape of surveillance has been radically transformed. But it's also a reminder that we're not just passive bystanders in this digital revolution. By being informed, engaged, and proactive, we can help shape a future where technology empowers us, rather than being used to control or exploit us.
That's a powerful message, and one that I hope our listeners will take to heart. We've explored a lot of complex issues today, but the takeaway is clear. The future of privacy is in our hands. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the ever-evolving world of surveillance. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay empowered.